Okay, so holding deposits. Let's just talk about holding deposits. This is now capped at 1 week's rent. For those let-only landlords that find their own tenants, do any of you take a holding deposit from a tenant, like a financial commitment? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, that's now capped at 1 week's rent. You must not take any more than the calculation of 1 week's rent. It's not per tenant, it's per tenancy. And here comes the issues around it, okay? An agent and a landlord are only permitted to take one holding fee per property. Now, as an agent, we work in your best interest to try and get you the best tenant for your property when we're advertising it. So we may do group viewings and we may have multiple applications. By where what we would normally do prior to June the 1st, 2019, we would ask all of the interested parties to complete a form. We would ask all of the interested parties to commit to a holding deposit, so they're making a financial commitment that they are serious. And we would then pitch them to you, and you would choose the strongest applicant based on the information. You can still do that, but you cannot take the financial commitment until you've decided which applicant you're going with. Because the minute you take a payment, you must not take another one. If you do take another holding deposit, you are actually now in receipt of 2 prohibited payments, the first holding deposit and the second holding deposit. Now, when I get to the penalties, you will see why you don't want to be in breach of that, because for each payment that you hold that is prohibited, a fine of £5,000 would be due. So in the case of that mistake, you would be potentially looking at £10,000. Now, I do think they are going to be quite reasonable. When found to be holding a prohibited payment, you will be given a certain timescale of returning it. But how lenient they're going to be in that sense, it will really depend. Like a landlord, for example, they may be a bit more lenient on a landlord than they would an agent. Because an agent is deemed as a professional, they're deemed as an expert in their field, and they should know that they shouldn't be taking those payments. And if they're doing it purposely in a view to try to get around this ban, which some agents will, then they would come down much harder on them. But it's very important that you understand that. You also have to then hold that holding deposit and that property for that tenant. You must stop marketing. No marketing must take place. You must not do any more viewings, okay? And you must hold that holding deposit for up to 15 days. So basically what you're saying, the minute you take that holding deposit, the clock starts ticking, and the tenant must enter into that tenancy agreement within 15 days. I wish they'd made it easy, because this is the bit that's complicated. How many people let their property to a tenant with the current tenant still living there? I bet a few of you do, because you don't start marketing when they move out, do you? You don't want void periods. So how can you enter into a tenancy when the tenant might still be living there? You could end up then in 2 contractual, legally binding contracts that you're not able to fulfil, and you'll then end up in breach of contract. So what you need to do is you need to agree a written extension with the applicant to agree that if you are satisfied that they have passed their referencing and they will become your tenant, that you mutually agree to hold that holding deposit for a further length of time. It doesn't have to be a specific amount of time, so it doesn't have to be for another 10 days. It could be until the tenancy start date, which is proposed to be the 21st of July, for example. Okay? And the deposit, okay, so the holding deposit, so that's about the extension and about the amount of time you have to hold it and about the fact that you can't take no more than one. Now, any landlords in this room that multi-agent with agencies, right? This is where I'm going to tell you now to be careful. So if you're advertising a property with 2 letting agents, we all know the letting agents are trying to race to find the tenant first. Of course, that's what they should be doing. If letting agent 1 takes a holding deposit on the 10th of June, for example, and we notify you, we've taken a holding deposit as per your instruction in relation to the referencing and so forth, but landlord allows agent 2 to take a further holding deposit. Agent 2 is not in breach, agent 1 is not in breach, landlord will be in breach. because the landlord isn't allowed two holding deposits to be taken on his property. No instruction has been given to the second agent to stop marketing the property because he might be hedging his bets in case this one doesn't go through. So if you do dual agent or you're marketing in more than one place, it's very important that you tell the other party the moment you know a holding deposit has been taken on your property, because this is a piece of legislation that applies not just to us, but to you guys as well. Now, the holding deposit must be returned if you as the landlord decide, actually, I don't like you and I'm not letting you move in. You've got to give it back to the tenant, okay? And you have to give it back to the tenant within 7 days. You also have to give it back to the successful tenant. So what that means is if a tenant has applied for a property through you, that holding deposit now needs to become part of their rent or their deposit. So their first month's rent or their deposit. My advice to you as landlords is to put it towards the rent, because we've got another whole minefield of deposit registration, and you have to register within 30 days and so forth of receipt. So if it forms part of the deposit, you could be falling into other areas of concern. But again, you have to agree with the tenant that that is what you are going to do. The holding fee that you have paid will go towards your first month's rent on the day that you commence the tenancy. Now, there are some ways that you can keep that deposit, that holding deposit, albeit in our area, I think our average rent for Wolverhampton as an average is about £550. It's not a huge financial amount of commitment. And in last month, May already, we had 6 tenants out of 16 applications withdraw because we started doing this in May in readiness. Whereas that's quite a high percentage as to what we're used to, because we would normally ask for a 250, 300 commitment from a tenant to protect your interest, to make sure that tenant moves in. So on a property of £300, we're talking roughly about 75 quid. It's not very much. It's not very much to lose in comparison if you find something that suits you better. So if the tenant does pull out after paying you this holding deposit, for whatever reason, you are able to keep that holding deposit. You must, however, write to the tenant and advise them under what guidelines you're keeping it, you're retaining it, and you must do that in writing. Okay, if your tenant fails a right to rent check, you also can keep that holding deposit. The government have determined that they believe tenants should know their immigration status when paying a holding fee to you and know whether they have the right to reside. So if they fail that check, you can keep it. If the tenant, now this is the interesting thing, if the tenant gives false or misleading information, you can keep it. But what that doesn't mean is if the tenant fails referencing, you can keep it. You can only keep it if the tenant fails referencing and they have lied on their application. So if I filled in an application and I say to you, one of your questions are, do you have any adverse credit, county court judgments, IVAs or bankruptcies? I select no, and you do a credit check and I do have them, you can keep it. If I, however, select yes, and you do a credit check and you say you failed, I'm entitled to my money back because I've told you the truth. So what I'm saying to you here is you need to do a little bit more digging. The questions need to be a little bit more detailed and documented if you are looking to keep that holding deposit, because you can only keep it if they lie, so false or misleading. So if somebody says to you, I earn £20,000, you then do an employment reference on them and they earn £10,000, you can keep it. You can see where I'm going. It has to be a lie, a meaningful lie, not just a fail. Now, if the tenant fails to enter the tenancy or be in a position to enter the tenancy, let's say they haven't provided you with their ID, let's say they haven't given you the references that you've asked for, let's say they haven't filled out the guarantor form that you asked them to do. In layman's terms, let's say they drag their feet and 15 days have arrived and they're not able to enter that tenancy because they've dragged their feet, you can keep that holding deposit and you can then move on to the next. Okay, so you can then start re-advertising, building up your viewing bank again and move on to the next. Be careful you don't extend. What a lot of agents were saying was, can we extend the holding deposit days immediately upon application? Because they want to try and avoid the administration. Well, you can, but if you do it immediately upon application, you're then giving them 30 days, for example, to get everything back to you, and it restricts you then with moving on to the next if you need to. Do you get what I mean? So stick with your 15 days first. Yes, it's a bit more administration, but if they do drag their feet, it means you can get that property back on the market and re-advertised sooner rather than later. And as I've stated at the bottom here, the reason for keeping a deposit must be given to the tenant in writing, and it must be one of the 4 pieces of legislation as to why you can keep it.